yesterday. But we thought that since in Indian Researcher, we are not only talking about academics, we are also talking about bringing movement and academics together. We thought it would be a good gesture, or rather, it should be a responsibility to extend our solidarity with the nationwide strike of the peasant and the workers' organization against the draconian agricultural bill. And extending that solidarity, we have postponed the class that was supposed to happen yesterday to today. So today is going to be our last class. The way we have organized it in the last sessions also. Uh, Professor is going to be speaking. There is going to be a PowerPoint presentation, and whatever questions you have, whatever query you have, you can directly ask in the other link. I mean, the link that where you are right now, and that questions are going to be asked to the person who is taking the class after the presentation is over. So I hope we are going to cooperate each other. And with that, I'm not going to take much time. I'm going to give this place to Dr. Zaad Mahmood for continuing our session. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepshita. Thank you for inviting me. First of all, let me congratulate you and the other members of Indian Researcher, because as a young researcher many years ago, the, I seriously felt a lack of politically engaged academic community whose contribution to politics would be driven by their academics. That kind of a community was something that I missed, and here you're trying to build that community, and I wish you all the best. Secondly, I would also like to begin with a disclaimer. The word professor, the professor is going to speak. First of all, this work in the gig economy, it's something that I'm also still reading and learning about. This is not my core area of expertise, but I'm reading because, as we all know, this is becoming a big dimension of work of the future. And so the way I have thought of this presentation today is that this is not a this is an I want to share my thoughts with all of you, and I want to present what I have found about gig economy and gig work, and then possibly give you some pointers to think about the gig economy. Is there an echo? Am I good to go?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a tentative presentation where the questions that I have raised are questions that are in all our minds, and this is something that I'm working on. So this is a work in progress, and I would really appreciate all your feedback and comments, and help me think it through. So let me begin by this presentation, where if you can see that I have changed the title a little bit. Uh, I've changed the word. So the point is work in the gig economy, thinking about a framework. So which makes it apparent that this is a work in progress. Now, how? Okay. So what this phrase gig work has become quite has come in currency for the last few years, and we are all familiar with terms like gig economy, sharing economy, work on demand. And so the question, we have some idea about what is gig work. So this word association picture, which I borrowed from Business Tech newspaper from South Africa, they basically did a word association with gig economy jobs. And if you can look at this, we see that we understand gig economy work or gig work as temporary short-term work. It is not only temporary, the workers or the people who work are considered independent. Some people have labeled it as alternative work. And one distinguishing feature of this independent work is that the remuneration structure is based on something called piecework. That is, after the completion of task, you pay. So the work relation is based on tasks. Of course, this kind of work has been pointed out that this provides autonomy and flexibility. This is big selling points of this gig work. You can make your own schedule, you can work when you like, and there are a variety of tasks available for workers. And finally, this gig work has an important dimension of digital intermediation. So, mobile app, websites, these are things. So, these four broad features, whenever somebody talks about gig work, we have such an idea. So, if you think about Uber driving, there is an Uber app. The driver who drives the car is paid according to trip. Uber takes a certain fee. The driver can work as long as they want or switch off whenever they want theoretically. And so there is autonomy, temporary short-term work, digital intermediation. These are some of the ideas that we have about gig work. Now, uh, yes, of course, why are we talking about gig work? Is very apparent that this kind of employment or work relation is actually expanding all across the world. In a survey, it was found that about 80%, in a survey, 8 out of 10 respondents had some, in America, had some kind of gig work experience. Out of those, about 40% relied completely on such kind of work for their livelihood. In India, as you can see, from 2016 to 2018, there has been nearly a doubling in the rate of such kind of employment. And the interesting thing is that in popular imagination, whenever we think of gig work, we are thinking of low-skilled service work, driving a car, delivering your food, but uh, increase even in corporate structures, even in more professional services, we see that gig work is expanding tremendously. And so even within big firms which used to be marked by permanent employment, this kind of employment is increasing. Now, there are two big debates on gig work. Of course, there are multiple debates. So, but I am focusing on uh, two, two, two debates on gig work, two big debates on gig work. So, one debate is that you see ads everywhere: work part-time, full-time, earn extra income, be your own boss, which is that gig work provides autonomy and flexibility. You will have the structure your leisure time, offer your work to a wider audience, and this is a good thing that is happening. This is an employment which will give you flexibility, which will give you more income, and people who have worked on gig economy have there are some Hall and Kruger have found that Uber drivers in the United States are earning more than taxi drivers, and they have more flexibility. However, this kind of work, and critics point out with very good reasons, that this kinds of work is actually self-employment, which denies workers employment benefits, social welfare, training, actually transfers the risks of employment from the employer to the employee. And so this is actually precarious job, precarity, and this puts workers in a even worse position. Another debate that informs our understanding of gig work is that whether gig work is something distinctive, something new. So there are some who would argue that the gig platform creates a new kind of labor market. It allows labor and skill arbitrage, and work is flexible, diverse. There is a certain autonomy for workers, and all of this makes gig work something unique, something distinct. However, if we carefully look at the features of gig work, the underlying relationships of gig work, one would not be wrong if one argues that it is a continuation of the restructuring of the workplace. So it is marked by contractualization, it is marked by fragmentation of work, and these are features which one has seen across sectors. They point out that the only difference is that now digital intermediation is or digital apps and websites are used to facilitate such contractualization and fragmentation. So this puts us another question, that whether there is something distinctive about gig work, or is it a continuation of the wider trends that is happening in the economy. So these are the three questions that I am seeking to answer, and I will present before you my thought process about how I am thinking about it. And hopefully, your feedback will help me think it through much more thoroughly. So, between the stark binary of precarity and good employment, how can we evaluate gig work? Second, does gig work signify or symbolize distinctive practices and structures of work? Is something different in gig work? And in order to answer these two questions, of course, we have to think about it. And that's why the title is Thinking About a Framework. So, how can we think about work? Uh, as Dipshita introduced me, I am by training in a political scientist, and much of my work previously has been on industrial relations, labor, capital labor negotiation, and so based on my previous thinking and research, there are certain fundamental uh, themes through which one can think about work. So the first question is, what is the type of work? The second is, what is the nature of the employment relationship? The third, related to employment relationship, would be what is the condition of work? And condition of work means income, work hours, controls, leisure hours within work. What is the work condition? And of course, all of these are all embedded in a particular social and cultural context of work. And finally, the most important factor is that work is, or how what work becomes, is essentially determined by the organization of capital, by which we understand not only money but also technology and other means of production. So, organization of capital, and importantly, how also labor is organized. There is a dialectic relationship between capital and labor within the workplace. Now, if you think about what are the kinds of work that are being done in the gig economy, or what entails gig work, you can think about companies, right? So, Uber, Zomato, Indian, TaskRabbit, Global, Upwork. Upwork allows you to post your requirement, and then people will, through the digital intermediation, the provide. So you're a customer, you can post what is your requirement, and then people who are willing to fulfill that requirement could be writing your thesis, could be doing some homework, whatever it is. People will write back to you, and there is an intermediation, and then they finish the work for you. Amazon MTurk. This is Amazon's thing. So while introducing MTurk, Jeff Bezos famously said, "This will be humans as service." So this is a platform where you can hire, just like you go to Amazon and you can buy things from across multiple vendors. This will be a platform where you can hire humans for service in a urban clap or urban company. So uh, if we try and think through carefully about what are the kinds of work, we can see that we can distinguish the kinds of work. So first would be crowd work, or it has been called crowd work by Di Stefano. What is crowd work? It is geographically untethered work undertaken by the workers based at dispersed location. So any work where the source of the work and the worker are in completely different locations, time zones, and work can be done like that. Now, within crowd work, you also get micro tasks, say, for example, human intelligence to perform, which computers are unable to execute. So, Google hires people to uh, to to actually classify images. Why? Because it is necessary for the AI learning. So humans can classify images still much better than AI, and so it is a micro task where human intelligence performs tasks which computers are unable to do. But we also find that professional expertise is increasingly delivered online through these platforms. So, for example, in Upwork, now they have this thing: if you want business solutions, if you want uh, business reports to be written, Upwork is also doing that. So now what we see is that there is low skilled as well as high skilled expertise delivered work. On the other hand, we have another kind of work which is called work on demand, which requires the physical presence of the worker. Uber driving, Zomato, the worker needs to be physically present where the service is being demanded. Now, intuitively, we can understand that crowd work creates a global labor market, whereas work on demand, the labor market is much more local. Of course, all of these tasks that are being performed through as gig work are work that can be individualized. That is, work that can be assigned to individual work, and the tools of production, be it a cycle or a car or a computer, all of this can be individualized. Next, following from the last point, that what is the nature of employment relationship? There is no employment relationship. Uh, Work is short term, independent, non permanent. So it has no employer employee relationship. Payment is based on completion of tasks, and so the idea is that each individual who's working here is either characterized as a micro entrepreneur, an independent contractor, or as workers with no rights. So these are the two dominant tropes about work in the gig economy. So the fragment and subcontracting, which happens in the wider economy, actually percolates down to the individual workers. And so uh, uh, nature there is so far hitherto there is no employment relationship. However, I want to point out something here, that whether employment relationship exists or not cannot solely be determined by the contracts that are set by the companies and the workers. Employment relationship is also subject to the norms and regulations of the state, and so the state can define employment relationships. In London, Uber drivers filed a case against Uber, stating that they were employees of Uber, and a judge actually pronounced that there is employment relationship, even if Uber explicitly mentions that people who drive for Uber are partners. So, nature of employment relationship is not only decided by the organization of capital, but it's a politically decided idea whereby the state has an important role. What are the work conditions of gig workers? Now, of course, workers have the freedom to choose one's own job, negotiate one's own work condition, and this is the source of the discourse of flexibility. Now, here, there one can notice a significant heterogeneity between the various platforms that offer gig work. So some platforms launch competition amongst workers for different tasks. Some actually operate on a first come first serve basis. So somebody uploads a task, whosoever accepts it first gets it. Some platforms mediate between the consumer and the provider or the worker, whereas some platforms just act as a facilitator. Just to think about it, when we are riding Uber, we pay Uber. Uber pays the driver. And even if the Uber driver is providing service to the customer, the mediation is happening through Uber. On the other hand, there are platforms where in gig work, the negotiation on the task or how much money is to be paid is done between the customer and the worker. So some platforms have a minimum price, which is fixed. Some platforms do not have that. So there is a heterogeneity in work condition, and this discourse of flexibility has been completely challenged by many scholars who point out that, of course, their workers are flexible, but the temporariness of their employment, the low wages, actually mean that flexibility and competitiveness are denying workers right, and they are engaged in a competition with each other, leading to a race to the bottom. So this discourse of flexibility is actually a facade, a euphemism for denying workers right. One important intervention, however, in gig work is the role of technology and the control. Now, of course, if you think about technology and control, uh, what Dini calls that it's a combination of electronic panopticon and peer pressure as an effective model of control. Now, uh, through the digital app and given the improvements in information and communication technology, it is possible to do real-time monitoring, right? Uh, through the app, or even now you have programs which can state that how many minutes I did not have a keystroke, how many minutes I sat in front of the computer, uh, when did I log off, when did I log in, all of that. The innovativeness of this gig work is that there is a introduction of platform metrics, which is ratings and stars and reputation. And what it does is that through these things, there is a control of worker. Now here, ratings is is actually management by the customer, right? So earlier, think of a big factory, right? In a big factory, workers are working in the earlier Fordist model. A big factory workers are working, and they are being supervised by a supervisor or a foreman or a floor manager. This is the kind of thing. Here in the gig work, uh, it is the customer, the consumer, who through their rating actually act as the manager. And so this is management by customers through platform metrics.
Through platform metrics.
And there is a third dimension to this kind of control, and that is the gamified practices that are promoted through these platforms and apps. Now, game everybody has played video games, right? So one of the uh, driving incentives to keep on continuing to play a video game is to better your previous score, right? And this is the gamified practice. So here, by the introduction of ratings and reputation, all of that kind of score, and of course, uh, uh, best worker and other kinds of, it is also evident in other sectors also, but the best workers or most valuable employee, the scores, the stars, how many 6-star trips, all of that, these are kinds of gamified practices to stimulate the productive disposition of the gig worker. Now, this kind of technology and control, what it has actually, two important things that we have to understand, that it has embedded emotional labor in the work, in all kinds of digital work. The focus is on emotional labor because it is not only how well you do the work, but it is also how well you present yourself, how well, how good you make the customer feel. All of this becomes an addition, has is an integral part of working in the gig economy through these platform metrics and gamified practices. And secondly, it has invisibilized the managerial figure, right? The managerial figure is the algorithm, and that algorithm works on the basis of stars and ratings by customers. And so the management or managerial figure becomes hidden and into the workers. Of course, these are not the only modes of control over gig economy workers. The, the more structural control over gig economy workers is the indeterminacy of temporary work, right? And this is what has been called by Kalberg as market mediated open employment relationship, which simply means that you are competing in the market, do not have a fixed employment relationship, and that indeterminacy and the fear of going without work acts as the greatest control over worker. So, given this brief understanding about the facets of gig work, how can we think about gig work? The first point that I want to submit is that gig work mirrors the fragmentation and contractual in the wider economy. This is the neoliberal restructuring, right? Shifting of responsibility from employers to workers, declining share of value for workers, and all of those kinds of developments that we see. Precarity of the workers, taking away the right to strike or right to protest because of all of these conditions. So, overall decline in the social, economic, and political position of the worker, and fragmentation and contractualization. Gig economy mirrors all of these trends. However, gig economy is more than fishering of the workplace. Now, this word fishering of the workplace was used by David Weil, where he was trying to point out that even in the organized sectors or even in the formal sectors, what you see is increasingly two kinds of workers, one full-time, permanent, the other contractual. Gig economy in one sense is contractual work at an individualized level. But however, if we think carefully about it, and this is what I want you to help me think too, is that it is more than a fishering of the workplace, because number one, uh, in certain gig works, because work is geographically untethered, it creates a global labor market which confounds regulatory structures. So labor laws are not applicable, or social or political norms of work are also significantly different across the geographies. So this kind of work and worker and their location, this disjuncture between them creates a new kind of situation. Secondly, the adjudication of work, supervision of work, or payment varies across platforms. And this is something that we need to think about, whether how that variation affects work. Algorithmic management uh, is something quite unique to this kind of work, and it needs to be seen whether it expands to other sectors or not. But there is something different about algorithmic management and the metrics for allocation and control, which we need to think about. And finally, given that gig work is individualized contracts where workers work with their own tools, some gig works actually blur the distinction between a worker and, say, a petty commodity producer. Like this is something that I've been thinking, that think about a Zomato worker who delivers food riding his own bike. That is a condition to work for Zomato. Now he is, by all the criteria and conditions, control and other thing, he is a worker, but he has his own bike. Now, with Zomato, maybe we can classify him as a worker, but what happens when we look at Uber, a person who has a car? Now, possession of a car in a country like India is an asset, and how do we locate that person? These are questions that open up about gig work. So one way to think about these platforms is that these are labor contracting platforms, but there are also service delivery companies, all within the gig work. And as I pointed out, the nature of work and employment is quite heterogeneous, and uh, work which is focused on worker experiences in the gig economy, actually, the rise of these contradictory tropes about gig work, that work that provides autonomy, increased flexibility, uh, and opposed to work that is informalized and exploitative. Now, these kinds of differences actually emanate from particular contexts of individuals, the structures of platforms, or the local labor market conditions, and these differences. So, for example, uh, Graham, others have done a survey of gig workers in the global south, across Africa and Asia. And what they found was that many of the gig workers were actually completing tasks for which originated in the global north, primarily in the US. And what they found was, because they had access to such kind of work, they were earning more and they had more income compared to their local labor market. Of course, work was more intense uh, due to time difference. They had to work at odd hours, and all of those conditions that degrade work existed, along with increased access to income associated. So, when we think about gig work, we have to think about the particular context of individuals and structures of platforms, all other things. So, how much time do I have?
You can, no problem.
No
There's
problem. I
no
can
time
continue,
limit.
right?
Nah. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah.
fine. So good. Thank you. So now the question is, how can we think about work in the gig economy, given that we have these contradictory pictures, given that we have certain similarities as well as certain commonalities with overall neoliberal restructuring? And this is the question that has been driving me, and I'm trying to frame an answer. And hopefully it makes sense. Okay. So there are what I propose to do is I would use three conceptual tools to understand gig work and evaluate gig work, because I'm thinking about a framework which could be applicable across. Now, intuitively, if you just think about it, uh, if we want to understand what is the nature of gig work, we'll have to think about the digital platform. The platform correspondingly here is the capitalist, right? It is the capital, the digital platform. Second would be the individual labor created in a particular social and economic context, which I'm thinking about as the labor market structure. And the third dimension would be how work process is the specificities of the organization of work process and control that is being exercised. These are the three broad components when we are trying to understand work. And so the conceptual tools that I want to apply are intermediation, subsumption, and labor process. Now, many of you are familiar with subsumption, which is a classical Marxist concept, or labor process, which also derives from Marxism, Braverman, and others. So I think first of all, it is not that the concept of subsumption or labor process or intermediation hasn't been used to think about gig work. It has. Uh, but given the complexities of these concepts, thinking of them together is kind of difficult. However, without taking all three into consideration, we cannot really come to an evaluation of gig work. So, intermediation. Now, as I pointed out, and as we all know, that work is fundamentally determined by capital, organization of capital, technology. Work is fundamentally determined by capital, and the expression of that work is employment relationship and the forms of accumulation. Of course, one might argue that why am I saying expression of work is employment relationship and form of accumulation? The point is, I am informed by a particular framework or worldview of thinking, which is significantly influenced by Marxism. Now, platforms are central to creating these employment relationships and forms of accumulation, right? It is the platform which connects consumers and providers. It is the platform which is creating or reshaping the market. If you think about it, urban transport existed for many years. What Uber is doing, it is trying to change consumer behavior as well as introduce certain sophistication in the service offered. So it is not only connecting consumers and providers, but it is also trying to create a market. Today, there is a market for Uber, which is outcompeting the traditional taxi sector, competing with autos. So the platforms shape work relation, they connect customers and providers. They are actually reshaping or creating the market. And of course, how they do this actually varies across platforms. So some, as I pointed out, act as pure facilitators. So it is like a online marketplace. People pay fee to use the marketplace, but you buy it from anyone. Others, on the other hand, are sophisticated service providers. Say, urban company, you get a haircut. They are a service provider. Platforms are also akin to business firms, and this is Strenisek's famous work on platform capitalism. And I think that's a very, very informative way to think about gig economy and gig work, because these platforms are like traditional firms. They are privately owned, they are looking to generate profit, and like the operation of logic of capitalism, these companies are in a spiraling need to make more profit. Although many of them are not making profit. Uber is a loss making company, but still it's getting capital, it's getting venture capital year on year. A fundamental nature of platform capitalism is the network effect. Now, just briefly to elucidate, a network effect is that for a platform to be successful, you need adequate number of customers and adequate number of providers. Without adequate number of both, the platform is won't succeed. It is no wonder that when Uber came to India, it was providing incentives to both drivers as well as customers to like us. Today, when it has penetrated the Indian market, urban transport, the incentives for driver is also decreasing, as well as the ride cost for the customers are increasing. So it has an inherent network effect, and it is capitalist because it ensures the extraction of values, it maintains control over workers, it monetizes transactions through proprietary software, and all of that. So platforms are like traditional firms, and the way they mediate between the customer, the eventual customer, as well as the worker, is what I'm trying to understand as intermediation. So some operate as market intermediaries, right, extracting quasi monopoly rent. Some act as shadow employer, exerting control over the entire work process. Some platforms transcend local labor markets. Some platforms are embedded within the local labor market. In some platforms, there is complete disintermediation. In some platforms, there is re-intermediation. So these, if you think about the nature of interaction that the platform one has with the platform, just as a customer, you can see these differences. So, for example, uh, okay, think Zomato, right? Uh, from uh, your, when you order food, a rider is appointed to do your work, and since that moment, you can track that rider, how much time that rider is taking, where from, which path or which route the rider is taking, and then you rate the rider. So as you can see, from the beginning of the work to the end of the work, you as a customer can actually track and have minute information about the worker. So Zomato as a company also has that, and it actually exerts control over all these processes. So it is control like an employer, right? Absolutely throughout the labor process. Whereas in some other platforms where you're contracting out work to such kind of absolute control, minute control of the labor process is not possible. So many platforms just take certain rent for using their platform. Similarly, as you can see, crowd work creates a global labor market, whereas work on demand does cannot create a global labor market but creates a local labor market. So there is a difference in the nature of intermediation within the platforms. Now, the point to remember here is that capitalism has always incorporated different modes of appropriation of labor to reduce the cost of production, ensure supervision, and diminish risk. So, within the capitalist structure, you had many forms of relationships of work that coexist together. And within the platforms also, we see such kind of a thing. Uh, Second, concept of subsumption. Now, many of us may be familiar with the concept of subsumption, but I'm using the concept of I am inspired and informed by the concept of subsumption, but I'm using it in a little wider sense. Now, the basic idea of subsumption is that how workers are incorporated in the production relation. Of course, in the Marxian sense, uh, it it means the forms of appropriation of surplus value, the modes of extraction of surplus value. But if you think about incorporation of workers in the production relation, one way to think about subsumption and a basic way to think about subsumption is through the nature of participation. How does the worker participate? For example, whether the worker participates full time or participates part time. another subsumption that is happening in this gig economy, which we might want to think about, and I want your feedback on this, is the self-reinforcing datafication. Now, in this gig work, a worker, once a worker starts to work, it generates data. That data is about workers' efficiency, productivity, rating, good comments by customers, and this data actually feeds into a computer program, an algorithm, which we have no idea about. Uh, at least I do not have any idea about, because these are proprietary softwares, and these algorithms process this data and ensure future work for the particular worker, as well as future options of remuneration and other kinds of things. So there is a self-reinforcing datafication which incorporates this worker into this world of work. Of course, we hear that these companies are also selling data about customers and others, but it also operates for customers. So you think about it, you are a regular Uber user, but subsumption doesn't happen for customers. But I'm just trying to explain to help you understand the concept, is that there is data rating matrix which feeds into the algorithm, and that algorithm uses the data, and that data generates uh, the chances of you getting work in future or you not working. So there is this self-reinforcing datafication that happens. And of course, the most important is the extent and forms of appropriation of surplus value. Now, the capitalist system, this is basic Marx 101. The capitalist system is characterized by two broad forms of subsumption. One is formal and the other is real. Formal subsumption is when absolute surplus value is extracted. This is the feature uh, of the guild system, right? The basic idea is that capital cannot control worker or the work process so as to improve productivity or decrease the necessary labor time, and as such capital prefers to extract an absolute amount, right? uh, okay, I if you need clarification, but I'll just give you an example. Think the taxi. So suppose uh, somebody owns a taxi. I am a driver and I want to drive for that. I want to drive that taxi. The traditional relationship was that I would pay a rent to the owner of the cab to drive the taxi for the entire day. It could be 300 rupees, 400 rupees, or 500. Now, this is absolute. This is formal subsumption. Why? Because I am paying an absolute amount of 500 rupees, undertaking all the risks. So if I earn more, I will keep it. If I earn less, it is my loss. What the owner of the means of production is taking is an absolute amount. This is formal subsumption. The reason being that the cab owner is unsure whether I'm going to drive all day or not, whether I'm going to work hard or not, uh, whether I'm going to be smart or not. And so it makes sense for him to take an absolute amount. On the other hand, if the owner of the car could maintain control over me or could monitor me all day, it would make sense for him to go for real subsumption, that is, appropriation of relative surplus. Now think of Uber. How much does Uber charge to the Uber driver? 25% of each ride. How can Uber ensure that taking only 25% of each ride is more beneficial for it because all the Uber can monitor the driver all through the day. All the rides happen, so driver cannot siphon off any money. All the monetary transaction is happening through Uber. Uber has control how much time the driver has driven, how much time the driver has been static or idle. Because it can exert all that minute control, it goes for real subsumption. I'm sorry if that was a repetition for many of you, but I thought for this clarification is needed. So, thinking about subsumption, that the common definition of gig work based on participation has been difficult. We know that some people participate in gig work part time, some people participate full time, some people participate at there are students, uh, there are people who have retired. So there are different dynamics of participation. Similarly, if you think about subsumption, gig work is there is a hybrid subsumption that operates in gig work. It is neither formal nor real. First of all, some platforms prefer formal, some platforms prefer real. That is understandable. But within the same kind of work, we get both formal as well as real subsumption. I'll give you one example and then I will proceed. Okay, in India, right? If you think of Uber, because of the uh, structure of society, labor market, and economic position in India, what we see is many a times the Uber car owner is not the driver. So people with capital, mostly middle class, they often buy cars and then they employ to drive for them and they lease out the cars to Uber. Now, if you think about the relationship that operates here, Uber is going for a real subsumption on the car. Uber does the contract with the car. And so with that car, Uber is taking 25% of each ride of that car. But what is the relationship that is existing between the owner of the car and the driver? So what we see is there are mediated relationship. Here we see there is a re-intermediation. It is not between the so the relationship between the customer and the driver. There are two intermediaries in between. So this is what makes this forms of subsumption quite hybrid, and we have to think about it. Finally, thinking about control, and I have talked about control, but I just want to mention it a little bit here, thinking about how control is exercised in the labor process. Now, of course, a point that I must mention, and I think I've forgotten, that it's intermediation, subsumption, and labor process. These are quite interlinked, but analytically distinct because the focus is different. However, all three influence each other, and so it cannot be seen in isolation. I am presenting this because I'm thinking about a framework. So think about control, and here labor process theory, which emanates from Marxist sociology, Braverman's thesis and others. I don't want to get into the details. The basic idea is that forms of subsumption, as I discussed, is actually influenced by the control over workers and work process. Traditionally, control was through technical and bureaucratic control. I'm not denying that information and communication technology has been used in this kind of traditional control, right? It is being used. What is unique to gig work is the algorithmic management, as I have mentioned previously, right? Now, algorithm is pivotal to ensuring both flexibility and control, and it allows control where with autonomy. Now, theoretically, thinking about control and autonomy, I think I have been inclined to think about labor process theory as particularly informative and instructive, because labor process theory looks at control not merely as domination, but also certain subjective disposition of the worker. So, and of course, as I mentioned, there is real-time monitoring, metrics, and gamified practices. Now, here also, if you think about the control, in some platforms, in some work, the control is exercised at the end of the labor process. So, in Upwork or any other work where you're contracting out a work, you have no way of monitoring the worker, but you can monitor the end product and you can rate the worker. Similarly, as I was discussing Uber, there are platforms with minute and detailed control over the work process. If you are bored and if you are lost with all those kinds of complicated ideas, this is a table. Now, this actually, the three conceptual tools of intermediation, subsumption, and labor process. Intermediation, I am thinking about, okay, what is the nature of work and what is the nature of intermediation by the platform. Within subsumption, I'm thinking about, okay, what is the nature of participation, full time with or without own resources, and of course, what is the nature of appropriation of surplus. In labor process, I'm thinking about what are the regulations that are applicable. Is it only algorithmic regulation or local labor market regulation, state laws and others? And similarly, whether the control is exercised at the end of the process or minute control. And it is in order to really think about gig work and really comprehend what gig work entails, it is my humble submission that we have to think through these these concepts and these factors that basically shape work. So gig work, and I know this is the part that I'm really thinking about, and I would really appreciate comments. Gig work is not a simple neoliberal restructuring of the labor market. Of course, there is an argument, and there is a powerful argument, and sometimes quite convincing argument that this is neoliberal work relation. This is neoliberalism. Now, I'm saying this is not a simple neoliberal restructuring of the market. Why? Because think about neoliberal restructuring, neoliberal market, labor market. One, it will be market mediated open employment. Take away or reduce as possible workers' right, make it make the workers dependent on the market. Employment relationships should be open, and after the passing of the labor code, labor bills, India is firmly on ground. At least if you are working in a firm which employs less than 300 workers, you are. So market mediated open employment. Second, there is a transfer of risks and responsibilities to the workers. And this neoliberal idea, Gary Becker and others, that workers, because workers should pay for their own training, workers should take risks, and workers have their responsibility, so much so that possibly the pensions and savings and provident fund, these should also be done away with, and the workers should be left alone. And all of this operate through contractualization and implementation. All of these features are present in gig work. So there is a powerful argument to be made that it is the neoliberal restructuring of the labor market. However, there are certain specificities of gig work which I want to emphasize. Firstly, most of gig work has a kind of a hybrid location. It is simultaneously embedded in a particular social local context, as well as it is disembedded. this kind of feature was actually, people have talked about this in the when the BPOs came proliferated across. And so here is work, but again then regulations emerged and everything. But here till now, the work and the worker remains embedded within a particular geography, a particular economy, regulations, politics. However, there are these platforms which structure work relation, exert control at a much more global level. So this creates a peculiar location of work. Secondly, this hybridity of subsumption and datafication is something which makes this more pernicious than possibly neoliberal restructuring of labor market. And 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 finally, this technologies of control, algorithm, market mediation, this minute surveillance, this is also something which makes this gig work uh, more capable of extracting, making work more, extracting more from the workers. And so when we think about gig work, and when we are trying to conceptualize gig work, I think these are certain things which we need to highlight. Concluding remarks. Now, the first, what I want to point out is that why did I start thinking about the need for a framework? Because there are existing interpretations of gig work, and those existing interpretations of gig work really focus on the uh, neoliberal work restructuring. Concepts such as precarity or precariousness have been employed to understand gig work. Now, while I have a problem with precariousness, because whilst it is instructive, it is quite Eurocentric and ahistorical, right? Uh, Insecure work in the informal sector has been a reality for much of the global south. So, gig work does not really mean precarity to people who are in the insecure informal sector, and possibly gig work brings in some level of formalization. So precariousness is quite opposite for the global north. Secondly, the experience of gig work has been quite heterogeneous and complicated, right? So you have people who report that they are happier doing this work, they enjoy the flexibility, they enjoy the higher earning, uh, uh, and and we have to remember that basically when people make judgments about, they are not making judgment in relation to certain abstract universal concept of good work, but rather they make the judgment in a particular specific context of of their location, of the local labor market conditions. So insecure employment is a feature of gig work, but it plays out differently for different socio-economic groups and of course geographies. There is a geography of gig work. So um, much of the gig work, at least the crowd work, if you think about crowd work, or think about the BPOs, much of the work actually emanates from the global north, whereas much of the location of the workers is in the global south. Um, for somebody who's a consultant, IT consultant or consultant, work employment is insecure, but the consultant earns enough money, and it plays out differently for the consultant, where flexibility and autonomy and ability to do their own work actually is emphasized. So again, gig work also offers us, this gig economy also offers certain possibilities. Say, for example, overcoming local labor market barriers, right? Caste barriers, gender barriers, which which we know operate in local labor markets, at least in India, racial barriers in other places, some other barrier, and of course there is a certain anonymity and distance, and allows people to overcome these kinds of barriers. Simultaneous to these kinds of things, there is low pay, at least comparatively lower. The work which comes in terms of gig work from the global north comes because the work is cheap. So comparatively lower pay, unsocial and irregular work hours, exhaustion, and other kinds of things. And of course, the problem that it complicates the distinction between proletarianization and petty commodity production. So, because of these complexities in understanding gig work, as well as how can we think about gig work, that I started thinking about the framework, and this is the framework that I am thinking of. Uh, Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your comments and suggestions.
Thank you so much. I think there are some questions already in the public chat,
Okay.
you can see.
Okay.
But before I go to that, there is something I was thinking through when I was listening to it. I think first of all, it's a very heavy and it's a very informative uh, presentation it had been. I mean, there have been
Apologies for that.
no, but I think you have given us enough food to think on, because gig economy, as you were telling, that it's yet not been very much academically debated and spoken. I mean, they're not as much as literature as it's available on the other things, since it's a very new phenomena. So I think you have given us enough food to think on. But there are two things that I was thinking while I was listening to you. One thing is that, as you were telling, that one can see gig economy as a continuation of the ongoing contractualization, subcontracting, etc. But along with that, there is a structural, or there's a fundamental change where we see, unlike the other neoliberal form of services, in this case, the means of production is not solely owned by companies such as Zomato, Uber, or Ola. As you were telling, that many times the owner of the car is a different person. I mean, the owner of the car. I mean, though a person owns the car, which is the means of production, but not necessarily they are getting all the profit, or the surplus that they're generating from their activity. So I think this is something different from. I mean, if I'm correct in thinking of how we have earlier thought of production relation in a very very classical neoliberal understanding. Second thing, what I thought. Uh, you also mentioned about it, that this surveillance. I think this surveillance, or this continuous monitoring, what you that has played a very important role. For instance, the reason why people opt for Ola or Uber uh, instead of taxi is also because there are, particularly women, they feel more secure
Security.
because you can be
Security.
tracked. The person you are going with, yeah, you can see the contact, the place that you're going to. You can be tracked through your GPS. You can share your location, your live location, to a person who you trust. So this fact that, let it be Zomato, whoever is delivering your food, you can see that person, their GPS location, they're moving, their live location. So all this surveillance, or all this somehow the control that you're talking about, that has actually played as a USP for people opting more and more for such services. I think, I mean, it's a interesting thing to how to position ourselves. Of course, there's
Correct.
a certain amount of control and surveillance, but that also had, uh, I mean, somehow made many people, particularly people. I mean, if you're a woman and if you're taking a taxi service, or if you're taking a Ola Uber, so I think that has also had played a very important, I think, a new role. So I think this is something I was just thinking. So these are just passing comments. I think we all will go through the presentation again and again, and we'll disturb you more if we
No,
come
no.
up with some questions
I,
and all.
I look forward to such disturbance. I took a risk because, you know, it's good to speak to people, because this is something that uh, there are questions which I want to address. But coming back to your questions, absolutely, absolutely, I agree with you, because my point was, and my starting point is that I started thinking about. So I was doing some research about with Uber drivers, and what I found was that Uber drivers were happier. Happier. The ones who came from taxi driving explicitly told me we are not going back to driving yellow taxis in Kolkata. So I work in Kolkata, and that made me start thinking that okay, I am interpreting this work, analyzing this work as something which is degrading, intense, but the worker's experience is not such. The worker is not making is not thinking in that those terms. So why is this? Now, of course, there is a temporal thing here, right? The workers were happy when Uber was giving a lot of incentive. Now, after COVID, Uber has decreased all the incentives. Earlier, we used to be happy. Uber rides used to be cheaper, right? No longer. However, Uber has managed to change our behavior. This security thing is absolutely right, which you point out. But if you think about it, uh, now one feels insecure during evenings and night, right? Uh, Earlier during the day, the sense of security was higher. Now, given that the discourse of security of Uber has entered into our minds, now people are using Uber all the time, even during day. So it is a complicated phenomenon. I'm also wrapping my head around this. But yes, and this uh, as somebody who was into SFI and did politics, I always used to think that workers have nothing to lose but their chains, which is absolutely correct. I agree. But this kind of work has brought in that before they lose their chain, they can lose their car, they can lose their computer, and all of these nuances. Now, just one point that this is not new. uh, Even under capitalism, even under advanced capitalism, such kind of work relations exist where capital is unwilling to take the risk. I'll give you one example. Think about the fishing industry. Fishing industry, right? Individual fishermen predominate the fishing industry even with corporate uh, uh, introduction of corporates in the fishing industry. Even within farming, because we are discussing all the farm code build and others, the corporates are not buying all the land and going for massive business scale farming. Why? Because farming is a risky endeavor. So offloading of risk, when capital doesn't want to take risk through a certain form of subsumption, has always been a nature of capitalism. But what we are seeing is previously, where capital took a lot of responsibility, capital is actually not taking any responsibility and bringing in those forms of relationship. So I'll stop there, but we can discuss this. Should I take the questions or will you give me the question? Okay,
You
I'll take
can
the
see
question.
also. It's there in the public chat, so you can see.
Okay, Shipra, the gig workers and customers negotiate their prices. Yes, there are. So if you think about, I was talking about Upwork. Upwork is a website which allows you to post an ad for your work and allows other people to respond to the post, and then you negotiate the price. Now, are there any such geographically tethered platforms in India? Not yet. Not yet. Not that I am aware of. But as you see, slowly and surely these will make their way into India, but not as of yet. Uh, but there are local things. So, for example, Facebook Market, right? Facebook Market is another facilitator. Of course, the Facebook doesn't charge you any money because the Facebook is going to sell your data to make the money. So it is also a market where you can it acts as a facilitator. Uh, Ali is asking whether individualized experiences of work is often also giving high flexibility to the worker. Is it an indication that in the coming future we cannot make living from one job alone? Um, if okay, if we think about if we think about uh, if we learn something from the global north, and if we think that the structures and the processes that operate in the global north will eventually come and operate in the global south in India, if we think in that terms, today in the United States of America, as I know in a survey, 8 out of 10 people said that they had participated in some form of gig work in the past 1 year. Of those 8, 40% of the people relied on gig work as a full-time profession. So they either drove Uber or did work through Mechanical Turk, M-Turk, or other platforms on a full-time basis. And the remaining 60% did gig work on a part-time basis. Now, of course, uh, is it the point to think about is that uh, all the benefits of gig work that you're thinking of right now is because gig work has a complicated relationship to regulations. Now, tomorrow, I'm just hypothetically speaking, tomorrow, if the government says at in the labor bill, the government has introduced certain parts where these kinds of workers are included amongst workers. But tomorrow, say the government says gig workers are workers and they are entitled to certain minimum basic benefits of workers. Then immediately what happens is the cost of gig work and the flexibility of gig work simultaneously will decrease. Cost will increase and flexibility will decrease. So, in a sense, is gig economy adopting for the future of risks? Uh, yes, you can think in that terms, or you can also think that gig economy is actually making the future economy risky. Risky in the sense that if we think of economy in terms the demand side, then possibly well-paid, well-protected workers are a good protection for the economy, rather than workers who are rather than things which could be sold at a lower price, the supply side logic. So it would depends. If I understood your question correctly, that would be my answer. What okay, Sadat, what is possible alternative to platform economy like Uber? Earlier, some trade unions initiated alternative app. Is old way of striking seem not to work? Platform capitalism weaken the structural power of capital. Uh, Sada, that is a politically the question that I think most of the trade unions as well as labor leaders are asking. One thing, is it possible to have alternative gig apps which would allow, like you said, that creating alternative app to Uber, and they did, and they did. It did not. It did not succeed, and one reason for it not succeeding is that any app or platform capitalism requires that network effect. Now, that network effect is enough number of providers and enough number of suppliers. Now, one way to get that network effect is infuse capital, give incentives to riders as well as providers, and get them on your platform. When Ola and Uber started, there is a intercapital competition, and that meant benefits for us, the consumer, as well as the drivers and the car owners. People were earning, and I know this, buying a car, registering with Uber in 2014, 2015, you could earn upward of 1 lakh per month. Today, that has gone down to around 25, 26,000 rupees per month because of those incentives and inter platform competition. But Uber and Ola have the necessary network leverage now, which these apps could not get because they do not have capital. Now, the only alternative to capital is social and political mobilization. So, for example, if the trade union says that all trade unions approach all the colleges and all the students, people like you, and say, use our app, and you respond to that call, possibly that app would have that leverage. So the the only way opposed to capital infusion, an appeal to the moral and political appeal. Are we in the phase of platform capitalism? I am quite. I do not have a definitive answer, because think of this one way: only work that can be individualized and contracted to an individual can be offered through the gig economy. Maybe due to better technology, group work can also be could be offered in future in the gig economy. But work which needs, where the tools or the means of production are social, in the sense a big machine or a big factory, that kind of work cannot be replaced by gig work so far. So far. Why am I saying so far? Because if we think of gig platforms as labor supply platform, who knows, sometime in future workers would be supplied by through these apps to factories, and there would be a classification of workers according to their skill set. Who knows? This is something science fiction, like that is possible, but right now I can't see that happening. I can't see manufacturing happening through gig platforms. But as I point out, if the platforms are focusing on supplying labor, then who is to say that these platforms can be contracted by capitalists or owners of factories to supply labor to them? And then it becomes gig. Has it successfully weakened the structural bargaining power of labor? Absolutely. But here I would like to emphasize that the structural bargaining power of labor has weakened significantly since neoliberalism and others. But the the antidote to this is the role of the state. The structural power of labor is weakened through platform capitalism, but through institutional intervention, these power can be this power can be maintained. What is happening across the world? Uber has cases in more than 30 countries of the world. What is the case? The case is that Uber says that it is a technology company which connects taxi drivers and taxi consumers. That Uber drivers have moved the court and said, we, we are employees of Uber, please declare us employees. A London court went to the extent of declaring Uber drivers as employees. Uber often violates, because of its nature of the platform, it often doesn't have to fulfill municipal, local regulations, governmental regulations. Think, okay, think about India, right? Taxi drivers, in order to set their fare, have to appeal to the government that please, today in Kolkata, a certain taxi union has gone on strike because of the diesel cost hikes. They want the cost of taxi rides to go up, and the government has to declare it. Why? Because by the Motor Vehicles Act, the government controls the cost. Uber is registered in India as a luxury taxi. Luxury taxis can set their own cost. Only if the government of the state or government of India decides that Uber is not a luxury taxi, but Uber does the traditional taxi. So Uber should be declared as traditional taxi. Immediately Uber would come under all the relevant provisions of Motor Vehicles Act, Contract Carriage Act, which would give government enormous control to determine the cost of Uber. and offset the leverage that Uber has in terms of pricing. So yes, there is a structural decline in the structural power of labor, but that could be offset. Uh, Vishwa, without owning anything or means of production, capitalism is furthering their pursuit of profit. Yes. Is Marx's understanding becoming so inadequate for analyzing the future of capitalism? Uh, First of all, Vishwa, big question. Uh, Now the point is, would you say that without owning anything or means of production? I would disagree here. I agree with the spirit of your question, because think about it. The big uh, hotel, or not, can't call it hotel, but the biggest room company in the world, or company which offers rooms to people, is Airbnb. Airbnb does not own a single house. The biggest taxi company is Uber. Uber does not own a single car. And so the means of production, that the immediate means of production, are not owned by these companies. And yet, these are the big companies of the future. Having said that, one important means of production in control of these companies is the app and the algorithm. Now, one may argue that this is the not the means of production, and that debate can continue. But I would also like to point out that it is through the app that the relationship are being established. It is through the app that this transaction is monetized. So, without thinking, like, if you think about it, Gandini actually goes to the extent of saying that the app is the point of production in this gig work. Why? Because it is the app which delimits the conditions of work. A worker logs into the app, a consumer logs into the app. A consumer demands the work in the app, the worker responds in the app. So the relationship of production is occurring through the app. The worker is monitored through the app. The cost, how much should be demanded, say, think about Uber, is decided by the algorithm, which is the app. And so possibly, I wouldn't, I wouldn't, or I wouldn't go to the extent of saying that Marx's understanding is becoming so inadequate. But of course, we can add to the Marxist ideas. So, for example, what I have been trying to do, and I don't know whether I'll be successful or not, is using Marxist ideas of subsumption, of labor process, for trying to understand this work. And of course, in that, it is up to us to really think about it, critically engage and innovate. Is gig economy possible in the production sector or only the service sector? I think I alluded to this question, Vishwa, in the previous question, where I said, if you think about it as a labor servicing platform, then possibly in the future it could be used in the manufacturing sector. But till now, gig economy cannot work in the manufacturing sector, and gig economy cannot work in the manufacturing sector. It is only in the service sector. Uh, but we need to see how the future unfolds, because if the platform is to supply of particular skill sets and categories, then who knows, in the future capitalists might use these platforms to get workers. But there are complications, because if you are a skill intensive industry, then possibly you want to hold on to your worker. You don't want your worker to be a free employee, because skills are hard to generate. It takes time. So, but if you are a non-skilled sector, possibly there this could work much more easily. Is contract the central pillar for organizing labor in the gig economy? Is it better for trade unions to pressure governments on improving terms of contract? In gig economy, is there any other negotiating power the labor have? Ah, Maruf, is the central I am thinking about it. What is the central pillar for organizing the gig economy? Is it the contract or is it the algorithm? Can the government ask companies that, okay, you have proprietary software, but you have to tell us how the software does it, right? Or at least, there must be something to regulate. I uh, what is the driving force? Yes, it is contractualization. Uh, or what would be better for trade unions to pressure the improving terms of contract? The point is, regulations on these gig platforms, the hybrid nature of gig work actually makes it difficult to regulate them. Regulations over gig platforms will definitely improve things for every regulations for gig platforms. So, is there any negotiating power for the labor to have? Of course, organized labor always has negotiating power. It is that you think the one missing aspect in all my presentation in thinking about work. I talked about capital, I talked about organizations of platform and everything. Did I speak about labor? Not really, because labor, as an individual labor, you can talk about the subjective position of an individual worker and their experience. But labor as an organized mass is yet to emerge in the gig economy, right? It is emerging. It is emerging. There have been strikes against Ubers in Delhi, in Bangalore, in Kolkata. People have gone to the extent of ransacking Uber office. But these are still sporadic events. There, I can tell you this thing. I know somebody, a trade union organizer, a junior of mine. He managed to get 70 Zomato workers under the union. Not a union, basically managed to get them together, and they wrote a letter complaining about their long work hours and delayed payments. And he took them to the local labor commissioner, right? The local labor commissioner was a good man, and really took their complaint and asked the manager of the Zomato of that region to come and meet him. What was the consequence? 70 of them lost their jobs. Simple. Was the labor commissioner able to do anything? Nothing, despite best of his intentions. What happened next? This friend's efforts to organize actually came to a standstill, and the efforts were then spent on finding these people other employment. Thankfully, these people could get employment in other gig platforms. So, on the one hand, these are providing employment. On the other hand, right now, labor has very limited bargaining power. One reason for this is the lack of organization amongst the workers. And the second, but more important reason is the perspective of the state. Because ultimately, capital and labor are under the regulation of the state, and we all know what kind of state this is. Uh, is isn't the labor joining out of no choice? Aravind, uh, I can. So Arvind's question is that gig economy is not only about domination, but labor have subjective disposition. Isn't the labor joining out of no choice? Uh, Here, this becomes a difficult question because we are going into the domain of subjective choices. So, for example, all the Uber drivers who have shifted to Uber, who were previously taxi drivers, how do we interpret that? Is it because of compulsion or is it because of choice? Now, here the question gets to this complicated subjective domain whereby how do we how do we define compulsion? Is it the lack of any alternative? If it was lack of any alternative, then it is compulsion. But if there are pre-existing alternatives and people choose to go there because of certain benefits which they perceive, then can you of course domination operates in all of these structures. I'm claiming that capitalism, there is a certain form of capitalist structure where there is no domination. But I'm saying, is it purely domination, or is it an adequate frame to think about domination? Uh, I think this question would could be answered only when we are clear about the level at which we are trying to argue our case. And so, is there a structural domination in capitalism? Indeed there is, at the level of the structure. Is there a structure of domination in the traditional taxi industry? Yes. Is there a structure of domination in the Uber sector? Yes. Choosing between traditional and Uber, is it domination or choice? I leave it up to you. Arti, okay, why is it more than can we understand as work on market? Uh, First of all, Arti, first contention was that work in the gig economy is neoliberal restructuring. If we think about neoliberalism as market mediated, open employment, workers will have uh, uh, contracts, there will be fragmentation of work, and if we think precarious employment, gig economy fulfills all of those conditions. There is no doubt about it. But can we understand it as simply neoliberal restructuring given the forms of control, the mechanism of algorithmic control, the role of datafication and how data becomes an important component of that control, or thinking about that how uh, the nature of subsumption actually it varies across platforms, and there is a hybrid structure emerging. So my I have an open point that if all these specificities of gig economies can be incorporated within the neoliberal structure, possibly I'll be happy to call it a neoliberal restructuring. But whatever neoliberal restructuring means, gig economy also has certain distinct features, and the question is whether these distinct features can be theoretically conceptualized through neoliberalism. I also have a problem with neoliberalism in the sense that neoliberalism has become so vast that it has lost some of its analytical power, right? Everything becomes neoliberal and then you can't define it. But if neoliberalism can incorporate all these minor, all these specificities of gig economy, it could be called a complete neoliberal restructuring. People have called that. I am just trying to think that can we think of it as a complete work restructuring? Uh, Understand gig work as work on market demand. Exactly. Uh, this is work which is market mediated. It is There is no employment relationship, and it depends on the demands in the market. And of course, uh, along with that, it has certain other features. But yes, this is work on the market demand. How gig work is different from, say, work of other informal sectors? Samiksha, that's a very good question. And actually, if you think about it, uh, this is something that we need to really carefully think about. Like uh, domestic workers, right? Uh, Home-based workers, and if we all they needed, if we give them an app, and if they're managed through an app, the kind of employment relationships that they have, the kind of uh, there is a lot of similarity in terms of the work relationship, in terms of the precarity and other things. Of course, there are some differences also, right? Now, the differences would be that domestic work, home-based work, the intermediation, there is no intermediation, right? It's a direct relationship that happens, right? Uh, in case of BD workers, possibly there is some intermediation, but in case of domestic workers, there is no intermediation. Similarly, in terms of domestic work, it is and home-based workers, it is locally embedded. It is the locally embedded work, even though the structure of work has a lot of similarity to gig work. I agree with you, but still it remains locally embedded. Whereas gig work has the option of creating a bigger labor market. Now, who is more exploited? Uh, that that is a difficult question. I would have to. It's a difficult question to really come to an answer to whose exploitation is bigger, given that the nature of exploitation has a material basis to it, as also as exploitation over one's agency of one's agency and subjective disposition. And so I'm sorry, I'm unable to answer that question, that who is more exploited. New kinds of gig work. Yes, drivers are simultaneously part of company and the free time do freelance. Yes, yes, exactly. So this is the thing, Auditro. Thank you for pointing this out. Exactly, this is what is happening. So why do we have this discourse of micro entrepreneurs or entrepreneurialism? Because you see, people are using their free time, and there is a lot of examples where people who are in the low-paying jobs are actually using their free time or spare time to do gig work and to earn some additional income. Now, this kind of person is different from somebody who is completely dependent on gig work for livelihood. As opposed to that, think about think about Prashant Kishore. All he does is gigs, right? He does gigs, one election to other election. His employment depends on getting those gigs. And of course, it's not the gig work we are talking here, but I'm talking about gig. In the US, if you get a 1-year postdoc, you will tell your friend that I got a 1-year gig at this university. But the point is short-term employment based on contract, open market mediated. But that is a good gig, right? That gig allows people to earn, being employed there, earn 40,000 rupees. And people being employed there, apart from the core team, are actually employed on a contractual basis. For this election, you are being employed. When this election is over, the core team will go away and you will find something else. So there are multiplicities of ways where people participate in the gig economy based on their own social, economic location, their skill set, and that leads to the diversity of experience of gig work. Right? I could have gone, but I think we have gone on too long. Can you suggest further academic readings to understand gig economy? Absolutely, Aditi. If you, okay, absolutely. If you go through my slides, you will see author's name. Actually, these are the uh, foundational authors and thinkers of papers which will give you an idea about the gig work. Now there are good books available. I was reading this book by Pressel, J. Pressel. It's called Humans as Service. And he argues that gig work is not something new, because in the 1920s and 1930s, before the advent of welfare capitalism, workers were subject to similar kinds of control, similar kinds of work relationship. What has only changed is the mediation by the platforms. It's an important book to read. Uh, Jayati Mukherjee, sir, could you please elaborate the significance of race to bottom and complications of... Okay, so what is race to bottom? Race to bottom is that when you outcompete each other and not and go to the bottom. Now think of it. You and I are workers in the gig economy, and Indian researcher wants a paper to be edited. Uh, I quote 20 rupees per hour, but because you need the job, you will have to outcompete me. So you quote 18 rupees and you get the job. Next time Indian researcher comes up, I am quoting 15 rupees because I know you are quoting 18 rupees. But what this is happening, because, so think about it. A global labor market which the gig economy creates has has two dimensions: skill and labor arbitrage. What is skill arbitrage? I can offer my services to a wider number of people. My market has just expanded. I can write, I am Zaad Mahmood, I have these skill sets. I can not only teach students in the city of Kolkata in my vicinity, but I can do a web lecture to any student anywhere if I'm adequately compensated, right? So this is skill arbitrage. I am I am using my skill and I can sell it to more number of people. On the other hand, the gig economy also is doing labor arbitrage. So what is happening? Not only I am existing there, my competitor is also in the gig economy, and my competitor might be situated in the United States of America. So now what is happening? Larger number of laborers are competing amongst each other, and both processes are operating simultaneously. That is why if there is a race to the bottom happening, whereby workers, because they are temporary, because they need this work, they have to accept or bid low to get the work. This is the race to bottom. And the complication between proletarianization and petty commodity production is this: that who is a worker? Traditionally, when we thought of, and this tradition is a long tradition, not last 20 years, but traditionally when we thought of workers, we thought of people working in factories who had nothing to sell but their labor. Why? Because as capitalism would expand, capitalism would actually incorporate labor into the production system, go for real subsumption, workers would be controlled, work processes would be measured, productivity, etc., etc., etc. What has gig economy done? Gig economy has brought us back to the guild system, which predates the factory system. What happened in the guild system? People, artisans would produce in their own house and then sell that product. So they would be petty commodity producer. They are not capitalists. They are petty commodity producer. They can make small products with their own tools and means of production. What the gig economy has done, it has brought that petty commodity production back into advanced capitalism. And this is what is complicated, at least it is complicating my mind. So proletarianism is when you have nothing to sell but your labor. A petty commodity producer is somebody who sells his or her labor, but also owns some basic tools of means of production. And so it becomes difficult to locate this person. What happens with subcontracting? What happens with so what is happening with subcontracting? The subcontractor who is doing the work earlier would have been a worker in a big factory. But because companies are outsourcing work, what they're doing is they're breaking work up, and then they're they're employing, they're asking people to do the work for them. These people are then employing workers or subcontractors. So this relationship of work has become actually very complicated, and that is what I was trying to point, that the distinction between proletariat and petty commodity producer becomes blurred. I think we have gone on for 108 minutes. This is too long. I'm sorry. I apologize to everyone
No, no,
for
it
going on
was
so long.
it was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And
I
and if
think,
and if anybody wants to get in touch with me, my name is Zaad Mahmood. If you Google, you'll get my university ID and my email IDs. Feel free to email me. I really look forward to your comments and suggestions, uh, because it will help me think about it. I do intend to write this paper, and let's see how it goes. But thank you so much, and I really enjoyed thoroughly. It would have been great if I could see you all, but thanks to the pandemic, we can't do that.
Mm. Yeah. So with that, we are going to conclude our session today and also the workshop. We'll be sending a quick feedback link to all the mails that has been registered and also in the WhatsApp. Also, the recorded video of this session is going to be out by tomorrow. We are going to process it, and by tomorrow we're going to send the link also. So whoever has missed it, if you have missed some part of the presentation, some of the PowerPoint, you can also catch up. And also, as Professor or Comrade Zaad Mahmood had said, you can definitely talk to him, write to him. If you want to tell us your question, you can also do that. We're going to forward it to him. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the audience who have joined in. Thanks for such a wonderful interaction, and thanks to Professor Zaad Mahmood also for such an interactive and insightful session that you have done for us. So with that, we are concluding our session today, and also this 4-day long workshop that was primarily done by Indian researcher. The very first intervention. So thanks again to everyone.